sooner or later in the life of the school and the head, there'll come a time when the fit is no longer mutually beneficial and the head needs to move on. What do you need to do to be prepared for such a scenario? In this video, we explore the circumstances around the head parting company with the school and ways in which you can make this process less damaging and more productive. The head of school's appointment, retention and support and management falls within the direct remit of the board, as does the dismissal or non-renewal of contract. Basically, there's 4 scenarios. So the head of school may decide to move on to another job or perhaps retires. Unfortunately, the head may be incapacitated or unfortunately dies. We don't really want to think about that one. But the other 2 scenarios could be a non-renewal of the head of school's contract or the dismissal of the head of school. Since other videos focus on the hiring of the head of school and that process, this video focuses only on the non-renewal or dismissal of the head of school. As with all policies and major decisions, these are best made in a time of calm, so that the issues can be thoroughly explored, rather than in a time of crisis, where you may be looking for the quickest or easiest solution. Decisions about the appointment or non-renewal of or dismissal of the head of school can have a profound impact on the school community, and, rightly or not, affect the reputation of the school in the short and medium term. Any new appointment of the head of school provides the board with an opportunity to review the contractual agreements with some fresh eyes. At least some eyes reviewing the contract should have a legal background, and if there isn't a lawyer on the board, then it's probably money well spent to ask for professional guidance from a local law firm. It's far easier to make contractual changes before someone accepts a job in the school, rather than asking an existing head to change the terms and conditions of employment midway through. That could lead to an immediate sense of disquiet or suspicion for the head, which is not really the basis for a mutual and trusting relationship. A lawyer's insight will help ensure that the contract follows and specifies the local employment laws and rights. While some schools are comfortable with just a brief letter of appointment rather than a lengthy contract, this comfort may have come through not having had to deal with a painful dismissal or a legal challenge, or maybe just lax local laws. But actually, it's not an excuse for being not professionally prepared for each eventuality. The head of school is likely to be the board's only employee, and one of the key duties is to support and nurture the head. But when the time comes to bring the contract to an end, it can be an incredibly stressful experience for boards, and even more so for boards that don't have thorough documentation in place to support them. So rather than making assumptions about what constitutes success in the head's role, the contract or associated terms of conditions of employment, for example, should lay out precisely what's expected. What would be the criteria for the board to decide not to renew a contract? What are your legal obligations as an employer to actually renew a contract? Employment laws are of course country-specific, and while there are some that may be clear-cut, a fixed-term contract is simply that and there is no obligation to renew, other countries may have a different interpretation by the labour courts. So for example, if a contract has been renewed already, the courts may be inclined to see the continuation of employment as an expectation or more like a permanent position, which can be very costly in cases where the court finds that there's been unfair or even constructive dismissal. The labour courts may also look for a process to have been followed. So for example, if the board conducts an evaluation and written feedback is provided that shows the head is not performing important duties, then he or she should be given a written warning stating clearly what or how the ineffective duty should be addressed and what would be the consequences. Depending on the local laws, there may need to be more than one warning or more than one opportunity to address these shortcomings before you'd have strong grounds not to renew a contract. If there are grounds for dismissal, whether professional misconduct or serious criminal activity, for example, then these should also be identified in the contract for the sake of avoiding ambiguity. Where the process and criteria for non-renewal or dismissal are clearly stated, this makes your job as a board much easier should the unfortunate situation arise where that may be necessary. However, you've got to watch out because that door swings both ways. If you're going to specify in the contract the steps to non-renewal or dismissal, and you choose not to follow those steps, then the board is in contractual breach and the law courts may seek appropriate resolution against you, including damages. Equally, you should look for contradictions that could be used against you. So for example, perhaps you have a performance bonus in place for the head of school, and out of some kind of sympathy or whatever, you grant this bonus, but at the same time don't offer a new contract. This is potentially then a contradiction that the labour courts may jump on. The performance bonus suggests satisfaction of the board and an expectation of continued employment for the head. Unfortunately, it happens all too often. A head has to impose policy or react to circumstances, suddenly becomes the target of a vociferous parent group that puts pressure on the board, and before you know it, there's a poorly formed private board meeting taking place, and the head is told that he or she has to leave. Little wonder then that under these circumstances, the relationship between the head and the board becomes very strained and even untenable, leaving a somewhat chaotic and leaderless situation behind. So in an ideal world, the head's departure is part of a carefully planned process that starts 12 or even 18 months before the start of the new academic year. While a few years ago it may have been normal perhaps to appoint the head early in the new year for an August start, even this is considered late now for international school teaching positions, but way too late for a head of school position. Of course, you may be forced into advertising a position late, even in the new year, but to have a strong field of candidates that would be available for an August start, that's going to give you considerably smaller options than advertising months earlier. Heads often have a 1-year notice period on their contracts, so this needs to be borne in mind when planning for the renewal process. Where possible, allow more time. How you, as a board, plan to manage the transition is worthy of serious discussion too. Where inappropriate levels of pressure are applied on the head or procedures are not adhered to, this can seriously lead to bruised egos on both sides, the board and the head, and often results in the withdrawal of goodwill, whether explicit or otherwise. When this relationship deteriorates further, it may be that the head of school takes sick leave or is unable to effectively perform his or her duties, ultimately affecting the staff, community, and impacting student learning. The ideal solution then that you should be working towards is an amicable parting of the ways, where the head of school retains the same level of passion and commitment for the school right up until the handover with the new head, and beyond, to be there at the end of a phone or an email during the first few months so that the new head can ask questions if necessary. When the board is not able to manage such a smooth transition, then either the head may be on sick leave or may have to be given gardening leave, basically to stay at home so that he or she no longer plays any part in the school. And this may require a temporary head being appointed, probably at extra cost, and again, probably with additional disruption to the school. So one scenario might be that the head has been receiving the support of the board, but is either not able to make the changes required, or is philosophically not a right fit for the school anymore. Where there's been sufficient opportunities to improve performance and meet targets, these haven't been met, and that leaves the board with the difficult decision not to renew the contract. In some situations, the board may have exhausted all strategies to support the head, and either relationships have become unworkable, trust has been breached, or the continual employment creates unacceptable risks, or if indeed there's been a serious case of misconduct, then the board may be faced with the unenviable task of dismissing the head of school. Whichever the case, where the decision is not a mutual one, that it's a decision that's been taken by the board, then the issue should be handled very carefully. On the one hand, the board has only the one employee and should tackle the process respectfully, and at the same time recognizing that the poor handling of conversations may seriously affect the manner in which the outgoing head may impact the wider school community. While in business, it may be common practice for anyone being eased out to be given, let's say, a severance package, collect their keys and simply ask them not to step foot back in the office. this isn't usually how it's done in schools, especially for the head of school. While this approach may be necessary in cases of gross misconduct, generally the aim is to manage the outward transition as far as possible to minimize the disruption for the school that ultimately preserves student learning. Sometimes a gardening leave or temporary head is the only viable solution, but much of the time it's really about damage limitation, and there are consequences of these approaches too. So for example, assuming that the head of school is unable to lead the school or has been asked not to present to work, then there are two options. You could appoint a temporary head from within the staff, or to bring in a temporary head from elsewhere. The internal appointment knows the school and the systems in place, but may well not have the skills and aptitudes to lead the school. If they did, then likely they would have struck out on their own to lead their own school already. While they do know the school, they wouldn't know all of the ins and outs of being a head of school. Maybe the finance aspects would be unfamiliar territory, for example. And of course that person may bring their own baggage, perceptions about how they operate, or the challenge of transitioning from being a known member of the faculty to stepping over the threshold to being a head, where friendship and cultural boundaries have now changed. What are the expectations should this temporary appointment apply for the permanent position? Would you entertain it? If not, then what makes them suitable for a temporary position? Or if you are going to consider them for the permanent position, how will they react if they're not successful? On the other hand, bringing in someone from outside isn't really much better. The person may have a wealth of experience of leading schools in the past, but what leads them to being available at such short notice? Have they retired already? Are they medically fit and capable of taking on the role? But then they would have much to learn about the school, and that's just for a temporary position, so maybe they're unwilling to do anything other than just keeping the school in a holding pattern. Certainly the board would need to weigh up the pros and cons of each of the different ways of handling the situation. A simple decision matrix of best case, worst case scenario for each is a handy way of visualizing the challenges, or when sharing ideas with the other trustees. So the bottom line is that when faced with a difficult decision not to renew, or indeed dismiss the head of school, make sure that you've already done your homework, particularly the legal options. Your fiduciary duty requires you to look at the inherent risks associated with action, or indeed inaction, and to contemplate the implications for the school, the morale of the staff, and the potential legal challenges. Where possible, make sure contracts are tight and procedures are followed so that you don't get tripped up on simple technicalities. But again, remember that the head of school is the figurehead for the school, and how you treat the head and manage the process will ultimately be reflected in the community. And so it's in your own best interest to think carefully, proceed cautiously, and act respectfully. To what extent do you think the head of school's contract provides a tight enough framework for the board should a non-renewal or dismissal be considered? What are the procedures that you would need to be followed to be sure that the labour laws have been adhered to?